Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's been a busy, busy, busy week here. I've launched two courses at IPAC EDU. I've just finished the lecture on analytics, so that went well. The course in biology yesterday went well. You're talking to, or listening to, I should say, Dr. James Lyons-Weiler, host of Unbreaking Science at the WWDNYK studios in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Um, I thought that I was a thinker and a reader and somebody that would synthesize things at different scales. I can go from talking about you know subatomic particles and quanta and maybe the hypothetical relationship between the spin of subatomic particles and magnetism, electromagnetism, all the way to ecosystems. And that's just a virtue of the fact that I spoiled myself with massive numbers of years of higher education. On this show, we had Dr. Gregg and Gregg is a psychologist, and I have a lot of respect for him because he's doing the hard work of thinking broadly, deeply. He's done it for years, decades, really, and really tried to come up with a synthesis of how in the world can science make sense out of things that are happening in our brain, and things that are happening from with our evolutionary heritage, how we behave in societies, and these moments of transition and scale. He's put together something called the Tree of Knowledge, and there's a previous video on this, the Tree of Knowledge theory of knowledge. It's really fascinating with the ability that he sees it all interconnected. I'm sure there's some open questions, and we're going to get to that later in the episode. But today, what I want to do is I want to get on this hobby horse that we're all on about sense making. You hear a lot of people use this phrase sense making. It's becoming kind of popular. I'm not sure everyone knows what it means. I've not heard a formal definition of it other than some kind of a rationalization or justification about how, yes, Western culture is messed up, and yet nevertheless we have these vestiges in our culture and we have to live with them. That's all in the Tree of Knowledge if you listen to and read closely to what Dr. Henrique has talked about. But, let's take off our Superman capes for a moment, and we're going to just get down to the question of how do you make sense out of the world today if you're a psychologist, and what does a conversation between a psychologist who's got a lifetime of experience with empirical research and another scientist of a different breed with another lifetime of experience. So, Gregg, welcome to Unbreaking Science.
Hey, thanks so much for having me here, Jack. It's great to be here.
Yeah,
I appreciate that introduction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right on. You're a rock star in my view. I hope we're still friends by the end.
Well, I hope so too, friend. I don't know what we have in store, but that's where we'll start.
Right. Well, I got you in my dojo now. So,
yeah. All right.
But first of all, there's a lot of discontent going on. I don't know if you've noticed with the protests over the Black Lives Matter. The populations of people with different backgrounds, people with different racial backgrounds, cultural backgrounds are like, wait a minute, if we're going to have a society that's based on equal, then let's speak out where we don't have equal. And that pent up frustration has come out in a number of dysfunctional ways, certainly. Some of it's strategic, some of it's intentional. Some of it certainly has been politicized. So
absolutely,
Black Lives Matter, and then of course, right at the same time, we've got this outbreak right now, coronavirus, different signals, different messages, different realities, changing signals. And from my view, where I stand, the New England Journal of Medicine just published a paper that said up is down and down is up. The pharmaceutical companies are telling the government to slow down on vaccine development. They have to be more cautious, right? So this is exactly like
everything topsy-turvy.
We stepped through the looking glass here. So sense making, I guess, is some generic way of saying, hey, wait a minute, we really have to slow down and think about this and think it through. So, what are you experiencing? What are your thoughts on a day-to-day when you see this crazy stuff going on with all of these gyrations?
Right. So it is, I've called it the age of confusion in a blog actually a couple of years ago. And I think that holds in terms of the accelerating rate in which the information ecology that we are in feels like it's breaking down. And so yeah, I feel like we're right in the middle of a massive amount of flux. And the old institutions, the old ways of making sense in terms of, say, paradigms, the old structural institutions of media, of governance, of finance and economics, of global international relations, of resource utilization, of technology, and then, of course, the explosion of novel technologies, massive transformation. So there's just an enormous number of accelerating change. We humans are, we're expected to sort of be born into a era, have a paradigm. We may go through one massive change. Let's say if there's a war or something, that, and that's fairly recent. I mean, for that hundreds of years, the same basic, say if it's a Christian narrative across the Middle Ages, that goes on for hundreds of years. You go back to the Romans, and people are used to ideologies, sense-making practices, rituals that are handed down through the generations. We're living in a time where the transformation of what seems to be real and true is happening so fast, and then so head-spinningly confusing from so many different angles that there's this chaos. And so what we're seeing certainly is, my friend John Vervaeke got very, pretty well known. He's a cognitive scientist, psychologist up in University of Toronto, wrote Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. And the word meaning crisis catches on because basically we're in an acute cultural meaning crisis where there's a fundamental breakdown in a shared sense of what is real, what is good, how we ought to live our lives, what's going to happen in the future. And so there's an enormous amount of uncertainty and confusion, and people are grappling with and grabbing onto certain ideologies. And that is, there are many of them. There's a multipolar culture war 2.0 is something Peter Lindbergh used. So there's a lot of confusion and chaos. I'll end it there, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So this reflective view of yours, do you find yourself participating in choosing sides, or are you a great collector of positions when you try to make sense out of the world? Do you try to leave no one out of your basket, or are all positions equally legitimate, or do you discern and say, hey, wait a minute, all right,
No,
this
there's
is
definitely right.
so you tell me what you think is a polar morality here, where when
Okay.
somebody's doing something absolutely wrong, when you read it in the news and you're like, that's wrong. That person shouldn't
Sure.
have done that. What's an example of that?
Right. Well, so this is a great question. One of the big, great struggles in identifying in the unified theory of knowledge system that I built, there are ultimate meta values. Okay, meta values that transcend culture and time, at least, still situated in a human perspective, but nonetheless, that's what I use sort of universally to make judgments. So these three meta values are dignity. Okay, so the idea that we're going to hold individuals with a fundamental set of respect. There's two sort of layers of dignity. One is foundational or fundamental dignity. When you're born as a person, you're granted, so then if you just degrade somebody or disrespect somebody for no reason, that's injurious. There's also personal dignity when individuals engage in, great strivings and courage and do beautiful things and those kinds of things, or behave conversely. So that's fundamental and incremental dignity, I think, in those terms. I think in terms of well-being, in fact, on the theory of knowledge tree behind me, the seventh branch is a map of well-being. And that provides me a framework for health, happy, the short answer is it's a combination of health and happiness, but it's more complicated than that. But fundamentally, we can just go with, do you feel good and are you functioning well, or are you miserable and functioning poorly? We generally want to help people feel better and function better. And then finally, integrity. So honesty, honor, soundness. I actually correspond those big three to sort of transnational institutions like the United Nations and the Declaration of Human Rights is grounded in human dignity.
Sure.
So that the World Health Organization, although it got sullied a little bit in the whole COVID reality, but nonetheless, its mission is to enhance well-being across the biological, psychological, and social levels of analysis. And I think of science as fundamentally committing itself to truth and honesty, accuracy. So I think of science along those lines. So dignity, well-being, integrity are value-based frames that I bring to bear. And when I see individuals consistently violating that, so for me, without getting too political, at a personal level, I have always found Donald Trump to be enormously problematic. I think there are a lot of complicated political strategies and ideas, and you can get tied into that. But for me, he lacks intellectual integrity. Okay, so he'll say things and not worry about whether or not he's being truthful in any ways. Basically, he's just trying to win. He just basically channels what he wants to say for his own advancement, and he's willing to be completely inconsistent or incoherent or at any number of levels violate what I would call intellectual integrity. So in terms of my core values, that's would be one. And I really don't think of it as political. I basically think, well, if you value intellectual integrity, then you really can't, then that's one of the big three that we have now violated. And I can't get behind people that consistently violate big three kinds of problems.
So I want to say you probably agree with me when people try to understand me as a scientist and why I'll show up on the steps of capitals and I'll ask the people, do you consent? Are you informed? They'll say yes. Do you consent? They'll
Mm-hmm.
say no. That exercise is to me not a political one, and it's not. I may be just hoping that I could rise above the foray, and
Mm.
this is kind of self-protection, but I really do, in a very, very deep way, find it extremely difficult to engage in political discourse
Yeah.
because there's way too much going on in terms of understanding people's behavior, thinking about it strategically. Oh, they're saying that to appeal to their base. That in and
Yep.
of itself, you're not governing from principle, and both sides do
Mm-hmm.
it. So,
Totally. Totally.
it's
I actually, I do not think of myself as political anymore. I try to, I'm either meta, trans political. So for me, we all project our, knowledge and skills and schemas. So I
yeah,
see our current political system as being essentially in the midst of a really nasty divorce proceedings. I've worked with couples. I've supervised clinicians who work with couples in nasty divorces. And
sure,
once you're stuck in a nasty divorce, then it's a win-lose proposition. Everything's emotional. You're there to make a case and get the kids on your side, and you lose all perspective. And then you're entangled in the nastiness, and that's what I see. Is the entire political system is essentially entangled in the nastiness, and to enter it means you're going to get nastiness all over you. So I definitely find myself further and further away from the nastiness because I can't maintain the values that I have. If I enter into it, it gets just crap all over you.
right, exactly. So I would totally agree with that. It's worth making an appeal to the higher cause of having a civilized society around us, no matter what your
Yep.
walk of life is, regardless of whether you're well off or poor, or if you're educated or not educated, regardless of your sexual orientation or your disdain for people that express their sexuality in ways that you can't tolerate existing on this planet. At the end of the day, you know, who was it that asked, "What do we owe each other?" Who
Mm.
was the
Hmm.
philosopher that asked that question? It was a big, important
Um,
question. I'm shameless. I'll look
yeah.
it up. This isn't a quiz,
Okay.
but
I mean, JFK who asked what we can do for our country. Kierkegaard had some notions along those lines, but I'm not sure if that's exactly the
yeah,
reference you're
it's an important one. So,
Yeah, look
I
it up.
think in the final analysis, I'll find it, but in the final
Sure.
analysis, I believe what we owe each other is more along the lines of the seventh generation thinking that, my son was very upset over the orange skies from the fires and the
Hmm.
climate fires, as some people are calling them, climate change, global warming. To me, is certainly a messy topic because scientists, I'll call them on the left, but scientists on the left actually fudged some data with
Hmm.
the intention of doing what they believed in their heart was good. They got
Yep.
caught doing it, and it backfired. And
Hmm.
and so, the seventh generation idea. We just need to stop shitting where our children have to live in every
Yeah.
capacity, whether it's
Brilliant.
how you treat your neighbors, how you
Hmm. I,
pollute, all the rest.
I think this will have the same theme, but I was part of a conference, a big history conference, this in August, that was titled "Be a Good Ancestor: How to Be a Good Ancestor," which I
Hmm.
very much liked. Which is, what are we doing in the long arc of
Yeah.
history, and what are we leaving behind here? And that's very much how I want to orient myself, so that the
Dang
arc
it,
of
you did it
history.
again, Greg. I wish I said that. That's a great one. Be a good ancestor. I'm going to adopt that
I
one.
stole that from somebody else. That's not mine.
Okay, cool. So actually, it's a recent person that did this. The author is T.M. Scanlon, 1998, and there's a YouTube video of this guy. We'll
Mhm.
have to put it up, but he asked the question, "What do we really owe each other?" And it led to a huge, you know, constructualism and constructivist attempt to provide a unified approach to the subject matter of morality, which
Hmm.
which is a fascinating thing to do in
Mhm.
1998,
Mhm.
and it's the right question that every person who does that self-examines where they're coming from, because the reason to me it's so fundamentally important right now is because a paradigm, a parody of an understanding of the left versus the right,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Having lived in both worlds, right?
Mm.
With
Mhm.
very, very much a recovering liberal, New York style
Mhm.
liberal, Mario Cuomo liberal, okay,
Okay.
where
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
role of the state is to do good for the people, and
Mhm. Mhm.
then to the other side with the right. And now I have books by Anne Rand on
Mhm.
this individualism.
Mhm.
The
Mhm.
question of what we owe each other is the right question for our time right now, because on the left, the idea is these stupid people. This is again a parody. I don't believe this,
Mhm.
but I'm paraphrasing.
Mhm.
The stupid people don't know well enough. The government should do for them and
Yep.
decide for them, and it has to be a liberal government. It should never be a
Yep.
conservative government. And on the right, it's get out of my face,
Mhm.
leave me alone.
Mhm.
I owe nobody anything except for myself. And on one
Right.
hand, and you get into a vicious kind of abusive cycle there. So I can see where it become like a divorce where don't you care about these children? Don't you care about these
Mhm.
women? Don't you care? This kind of thing. Of course I care, but I'm going to determine to the extent that I'm going to engage in that social contract
Mhm.
on a day-to-day
Absolutely.
basis. I'm not going to
Sure.
live my life giving away the keys to the shop, because when you do that, then there's somebody that takes. So this I question of what we owe ourselves as rational creatures. It's the core of virtue. Um,
Mhm.
Again, the name for those who want to look it up is T.M. Scanlon, Scanlon. It fits in the tree of knowledge in the behavior aspects of
Mhm.
the concepts of mind. On another group, we're talking a lot about the theory of mind as well. Um, so if we take a moment and we say, all right, do I have all the answers for the next year in my own personal life? No, I don't.
Mhm.
I don't. No
Clearly.
one, no one
Mhm.
really does. And you could get
Mhm.
a curveball. Do I have all of the answers in my own personal life for the next 5 years? Unlikely. How about my own personal life for 10 years? No way, right? Now you
Sure.
all bets are off. So how dare we think as individuals by joining a group when we know consensus alone does not determine the truth, right?
Absolutely.
Then how in the
Mhm.
world can we dare join a group politically and say, I know that this paradigm, this collection of paradigms, is the one that I want the world to be programmed by,
Mhm.
when the United States was founded on the principle of individualism? One of the principles was individualism. You have to make your own
Mhm.
way. You should make your own way. It's ethically correct to stand up for yourself, and yet stick together. The
Mm.
founding fathers had this yin and yang on
Mhm.
that, right? The
Mhm.
Federalists,
Mhm. Sure.
and
Mhm.
the people that wanted everybody to be together versus the states, all individual, more states power.
Mhm.
then on top of that, you would superimpose this left versus right that changes the entire spectrum changes left. It shifts a little bit every year, left and right with the ebb and flow of the times, to the point where people who identify as Democrats, like right now, would get
Hmm.
into a very like a existentialist argument with themselves 10 years ago, right?
Hmm.
So that's
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
subjectivity. And I think where you stand and where
Sure.
I stand and people like us is, if you're going to govern from a set of core principles,
Hmm.
and those
Right.
core principles are the ones that for you that you just laid out. I believe in doing for others when you see the need, if you
Hmm.
can, but not to the point where it's going to hurt you, but voluntarily. It
Hmm.
absolutely should be voluntarily. And I
Hmm.
really don't
Hmm.
I don't know any other core ethic
Hmm.
um, that in the area of balancing individual rights
Hmm.
versus group rights.
Hmm. Yep.
And we're stuck with
I.
this these vestiges of our
Hmm.
Paleocene you know, Holocene ancestors, right? So
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
tribalism,
Hmm.
what's your tribe? That's actually a thing, right? So what tribe? What do you
Sure.
identify with? And identity
Hmm.
politics.
Hmm.
It's a wonderful mosaic and tapestry, and it's just I don't know how history is going to write about this time. I,
No, this is, I think it's an unbelievable flux time that, yeah, it's very hard. I certainly will echo your sentiment there that first principles or fundamental principles. Um, Very often, I'll give you another analogy from, what I will do if we're in the midst of a divorce kind of proceedings, but their children, usually both mom and dad love the children. So that becomes a first principle that your hostile exchanges are hurting the children. And I would like us to apply that to our lives, to governance and others. And that gets back to a good answer kind of thing. And then it's like, yeah, what are the first principles that we can, and core principles, the values that we would share as, participants and citizens in the United States of America, if we're talking about our country. And then what are the good that we can build off of? What are our problems and needs? And not what is our political tribe, and we know that we're smarter than the other group, or we know we're just better than them, and we're going to have to influence attention and power and money so that we win and they lose. That's just not. It's reached an excessive point of and it's just not healthy, and we're paying for it as sort of the children or the people of the United States, and I hope we figure out a way to turn it around.
I think technology plays a role in here too. Wouldn't you agree that, certainly since information is so accessible, I'm surprised. I'm teaching these classes online now at ipac-edu.org, and I'm surprised that with a little bit of hunting, I can find out a lot about the students. I
Mm-hmm.
want their mailing address. I can find it. I just ask them for it. They send it to me. But
Sure.
if they don't send it, and I want to find out who somebody is. I could pretty well figure it. And so it's almost as though we have this nation, this very large nation. The United States is a huge country. That we're going to be running it like a village, and
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't scale that way at all. The tensions,
Right.
if you take nation scale, it matters of nation scale importance, and you bring it down like it's a town meeting,
Mm-hmm.
and that this person say because they're a member of society absolutely will dictate whether or not we buy a new snowplow this year. That's an important question for a town or a village. But if a small minority group of people have that level of influence over the entire population, there's something instinctual in us that says, I hope they get it right, but I don't think that process was right. Right? The process is
Right.
not right. When you have a tiny
Right.
minority of people running the country
Mm-hmm.
for a
Mm-hmm.
huge number of people, there's something intrinsically wrong. And
Totally.
I've become enamored lately with the idea of restructuring um, government processes, right? So we have this kind of like top down, we've got POTUS and we've got
Mm-hmm.
his
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
administration, and then we
Yep.
have Senate committees and so on,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
Congress. We know enough now that that's not a very intelligent um, system. It's not designed
Absolutely.
as an intelligent system. And yet, I've actually proposed that we could say for bio warfare, bio threats, we could actually structure a series of committees as a neural network. We could
Mm-hmm.
physically structure the information flow as a neural network.
Mm-hmm.
So by design, it has to learn.
Mm-hmm.
It
Right.
can't do anything but learn until we get a
Mm-hmm.
bad actor in there that says, I'm going to be a stickler and I'm going to upset the apple cart. But
Right.
at the end of the day, that neural network doesn't turn to POTUS and say, so what do
Mm-hmm.
you think? The neural
Sure.
network is the Senate Intelligence Committee turns to the President of the United States on matters of security and involving bioweapons and so on, and
Hmm. Hmm.
informs the president what's been
Hmm.
decided.
Right.
And then he
Exactly.
can politically say, this is what I've done or whatever, it doesn't matter.
Right.
But it
Right.
depoliticizes it so that his opinion actually becomes much, much less important, or her opinion
Hmm. Hmm.
becomes much, much, much less important. And he's got way too much say. Any president of the
Right.
United States right now has way, way, way too much say over policy.
Totally. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I like the sound of that, and that's just so one of the things about why things are going crazy is the digital. So the digital world, the way it processes, stores information, the way computation works, the way computational artificial intelligence systems operate, the communications networks that we've developed. Okay, we have laid down a radically new landscape of being through the digital, and everything from the tree of knowledge system will tell you is that information processing communication networks are absolutely central. And we've just built a whole new one. And that's going to mean that all the old infrastructures that we used for regulating flow now is potentially out of date. And so
Oh yeah.
now, you're just, so yeah, the old broadcast system, the old governance system, a broadcast media system, the old government system of checks and balances in that regard, and the way they gathered information and made decisions and all of that other stuff is just not up to the task. And we need to think absolutely differently about the way in which systems, algorithms learn, how people interface with them, how to create networks of understanding, collective intelligence distribution, and utilize those elements to do better sense making, to bring it back to that term,
Exactly.
and make better decisions fundamentally. Because that's part of what's happening is, our old decision making and sense making systems are trying to operate on a system that now is changing and has so many different flux variables that it's just, they're completely out of date and they're dinosaurs.
Right. And their struggle to persist. That's
Right. Well,
really
that's yeah. So there's a massive amount of inertia, and ego, and influence, and everything that tries to keep stasis. And one of our huge challenges then, where is there's always a matter of massive flux, is well, you have a huge distance to go, but you're in an inertia system that wants to maintain equilibrium. How the hell are you going to make the right phase shift to get that big a change while maintaining enough stability that the whole thing doesn't come off the rails and manage all the resistance that you're up against? And that's
Yeah, I think
you know.
that's well stated. The patriarchal system, for instance, it's
Mhm.
unacceptable, and it has been acceptable all this time that a woman doing the same work as a man, of course, doesn't get equal pay.
Right.
Right? To me, that's something that makes perfect sense. I would hate as a woman to think that I was valued less than,
Totally. Of
right?
course.
It's
Hmm.
it's patently obvious, and yet there it sits. It's still legal to pay one person less than the other based on their genitalia. It seems really um, backwards and harmful to so the persistent patriarchy appears to be on its way out, and yet how, like, an example of that is, how do we do something like give opportunities to people who didn't know that they had opportunities, who were qualified to take advantage of those opportunities, engage in those opportunities to their own best ability,
Hmm.
without putting other people at a relative disadvantage and cost. And part of it is to stop playing the damn zero sum game. I mean, it's
Hmm.
like, okay, if you shifted everybody's IQ with a pill right now, let's say you could do that.
Hmm.
Is that a good
Hmm.
thing or a bad thing? I don't know, right? That's the
It's a good
scary thing,
question.
right? If you
Right.
shifted it upwards, if
Hmm.
you made it
Right.
made everybody, added 30 IQ
Hmm.
points, we'd have a lot of seriously smart people, like seriously super smart people. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It all depends on what they do with it.
Hmm.
It doesn't
Sure.
matter what your IQ is. It depends on how you act and behave in terms of your morality. And if you make a lot of people who are, say, criminally bent into super smart people, right? Then okay, we're in trouble. By the same
No doubt.
token, by the same token, I don't know where the idea of a zero-sum game comes from. If we're going to have, say, affirmative action, how in the world did we come to a limited number of colleges and universities when we could just build more?
Mm.
Where did the idea of, okay, we're gonna cut off a certain number of people because of affirmative action, because of rectifying things in the past, when in reality, why in the world would you hold any people down when you could just build more universities. Right? There's,
Well,
you know,
certainly right. So I think for me, so yeah, mutualism, raising the management of synergy as opposed to competition. Competition always going to be present at some level. You need to have it, but it's in dialectical tension with elements, and then it's the awareness of where you want to direct your energies and how to direct energies that maximize mutual value across systems, and that's what we want to leverage, and we don't always have the right frame on that, no doubt.
yeah, totally. So I'm not sure if anybody listening has got a better kind of map on what to do about the complexities of the world, but in terms of making sense, I think we can say that we're kind of aghast at where things are going, and we're both concerned about where it's going to end up.
Amen to that.
All right,
Amen to
this
that.
oh cool. So I wanted to go a little bit into your tree of knowledge last time. We're not going to go over the details again, but the tree of knowledge system, which you have laid out
Mm-hmm.
a multi-hierarchical nested um, layering of reality, and how knowledge and information on one level feeds into another, all of them
Mm-hmm.
being imperfect at this time. So I'm not going to hold you
Mm-hmm.
responsible for the fact that to make quantum physics work, they actually had to do renormalization because
Of
they kept
course.
running into infinities, right? That kind
Right.
of,
Well, there are a couple of parameters. You got to, what is it, 26 of them or whatever, renormalization parameters that you have to manage in order to make the equations work. But
right.
yeah.
I'm not going to hold you
So
accountable for those details, but I do have some questions for you since we talked last
sure,
time. So
please.
welcome. So I want to talk about justification because in
Okay.
Popper was vehemently opposed by a justification system as a fundamental defensible basis of empirical knowledge, theory of knowledge, if you will, in part because it led to the problems like infinite regress. There's always one more explanation, and you use the term justification a lot, and I want to give you.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really understand um, in the tree of knowledge per se. What do you mean by a justification system?
Good.
So, just in a
Yep.
general
Mm-hmm.
way, what's your definition
Sure.
of a
Okay.
justification system?
Yeah, I do use this term a lot. It's got a lot of kind of like Kuhn uses the term paradigm a lot. I'm going to use justification a lot. So the context matters. A justification system is a network of propositions. Okay, so part of our knowing system is propositional knowledge. A justification system is a propositional network system that functions to legitimize what is and ought to be.
Okay, that sounds good. What I want to say is, let's say an example. If I'm a scientist and I want to know
Mm-hmm.
if, let's say, just a hypothesis that came to my mind as I was on a hike the other day. Um,
Okay.
do butterflies sense consciousness of people who are watching them? So let's just say it's an empirical question. Maybe they
Mm-hmm.
have some way of sense, some way of their pigmentation. They can sense that they're being looked at, and so I
Mm-hmm.
want to test this hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to videotape butterflies being watched by people and not being watched
Mm-hmm.
by people. And my hypothesis is not a random hypothesis. It's
Mm-hmm.
if a butterfly could know that it's being watched,
Mm-hmm.
it might not light. It might continue to fly longer
Mm-hmm.
so that a predator
Mm-hmm.
won't nail it.
Yep.
So there's great
Sure.
incentive to have this
Mm-hmm.
ability.
Yep.
The question. So I go about this and I say, all right, I'm going to set up an experiment. It's an
Mm-hmm.
observational experiment.
Uh-huh.
So it's not a true experiment. It's an observational
Mm-hmm.
study. But nevertheless, I go into the field. I set up cameras at every butterfly in the field. For uh, you know, for this field, they're being watched. In this other field, same time. We don't have any confounding variables over time. They're not being
Mm-hmm.
watched, and then I switch fields, and then I take the measurements. How often do butterflies stay alight while they're flying around?
Sure.
And I do this
Mm-hmm.
for a good period of time, maybe 4 hours. Do a couple of days in a row, and I get a
Mm-hmm.
lot of data points. And I do my
Yep.
calculations, and I guess what I do a
Mm-hmm.
t-test. The average flight time for butterflies that are being watched by human beings is
Mm-hmm.
higher. This is
Mm-hmm.
hypothetical; it's not real.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm. Yep.
then those that are not being watched, and so then I can invoke a hypothesis of explanation that
Mm-hmm.
says my interpretation is the evidence is telling me from that critical test. Here we are. Look at, I think there's something here.
Mm-hmm.
So where does a justification concept that you just defined fit into any of that?
Okay. So, I mean, according to this framework, we want to think about science as a system of justification itself. Okay, that adopts a foundational set of assumptions. I often call it men's knowledge, and I do this to be provocative, and then I'll dialogue about where we go with that. But
Sure.
it's modernist as opposed to pre-modern. Different kinds of assumptions, which are more metaphysically grounded and theologically grounded. But a modernist, it's empirical, and really, I mean, external empirical, third person, exterior empiricism. It is naturalistic as opposed to supernatural, meaning that it's grounded in a continuity of substance and cause and science. So that then you situate yourself and you say, well, okay, now I'm going to place myself in a particular sense-making frame of reference. In this case, then be modern evolutionary biology, perhaps. That would then create a set of cause sequences that would then allow you to narrate a causal explanatory framework. Okay, that then gives rise to a particular type of hypothesis and logic, which you then set up to determine whether or not you can rule out some alternative explanations, although mostly you've been talking about confirmatory as opposed to disconfirmatory alternative explanations. But then you'll make inference to best explanation in the context of that particular set of parameters and say, I think that there is a predator detection mechanism in butterflies that allows them to be sensitive to this particular kind of stimuli and take behavioral investment activity to avoid predation. And so now you have a narrative, what I would call a justification narrative, that maps your experimental data in the context of a scientific system of justification.
So, is there anything other to a justification system that you're talking about other than just explanation? So, in some of your other communications, you've talked about science leading to a best explanation. And by the way, I want to go back to the null hypothesis testing, where I said the mean flight time between the two, sets of observations was the
Mm-hmm.
same. In null
Mm-hmm.
hypothesis testing, we're supposed to I thought we were not doing confirmatory. We thought we were trying to disprove that hypothesis.
Well,
Um,
right. It depends on the setup, but much of the time, what people say that they're trying to disconfirm, they actually have a confirmatory. That's why we get into a replication crisis and a whole bunch of other shit stuff. That
exactly. That's why we're here.
there's a lot more.
That's
Yes,
why we're here. Okay.
many individuals are confused, in my opinion, the confirmatory versus disconfirmatory frames of much of experimental design. But that's a whole nother sort of philosophy of
But that's why
layer
we're
of
here.
philosophy of science.
This is exactly why we're here. The first three episodes of Unbreaking Science goes into p hacking. It goes into all of it. This. That's
Perfect.
why this
Yep.
show exists.
Well,
So
great. Good.
I want to be sure that I get this right, because there may be people that are out there. I identified it as an observational study, which to me
Mhm.
means that we can't know causality. We can get some idea towards causality.
Right. Fair
But
enough.
because of the
Right.
other things I haven't measured, right, that I don't
Hmm.
know about, there's these things that are
Right.
outside of my experience. There's all these potential other factors, and if you look for them long enough, that on the one end, if you don't look for them at all, you can end up with a problem where you're not making sense out of your own data. But on the other end,
Hmm.
if you look for in a small setup like this, where I have 4 hours of observation, if I start measuring everything around that setup, the color of the shirts that people are wearing, the
Sure.
types of shoes, the perfume they're wearing, whatever, and then I look at in the environment and I start measuring everything I can measure.
Hmm. Of
Statistically, you measure 100 variables, you're going to find confounders that are perfectly
course.
explanatory of the data, but they're not confounders. They have no
Hmm.
causal relationship. It's just the fact that
Hmm.
you went in
Right. If
large
you measure a
dimensions in the
thousand
wrong
things, you're
direction,
gonna.
right? So you blew
Yep.
up your study. So there's and so in terms of back to the original question, I didn't let
Hmm.
you answer it because we went into this other discussion yet. But in that, is there something more than just, okay, I have the setup. It's based on the kind of central tenets of good experimental design. That in and of itself is part of the justification system, in your view?
No, no. So it is confusing, but basically, the main thing that you want, what happened to me in terms of this concept is you really want to think about, you have, as a human being, you have a couple of different knowledge systems. Okay. You have a procedural knowledge system, all right, which allows you to regulate your body and engage in basic activity and download this into habits. Okay. You have a perspectival knowledge system that allows you to collapse your senses together and create a field of experience in a first person perspective. We can get into that in terms of consciousness. You have a participatory dynamic capacity to age in things that are constantly changing, new, jazz, dance would just be some classic examples of participatory. And then there's propositional knowledge systems that we generate. Okay, so propositional knowledge, certainly more dominated by left hemisphere language-based thinking. Indeed, it requires a semantic syntactical structure for propositional knowledge. Okay, so propositional knowledge emerges on the scene with language in a particular way. And the justification hypothesis and justification systems theory is the idea that propositional knowledge emerges on the scene in humanity, say between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago, or at least it would be corresponding with the mind's Big Bang, so that all of a sudden we opened up a radically new landscape, okay, of ways of being in the world. That basically added a whole nother mind on top of our animal mind, right, and then allowed us to build what I call the culture person plane of existence. So the culture person plane of existence is these systems of justification, originally in the oral indigenous narrative tradition, and then later in writing and more advanced civilization kinds of notions. And then ultimately we get a modern scientific kind of justification system that emerges. So what I want to do is I want to use the concept of justification as a way to understand the functional organization of propositional networks. Okay, that's basically. And then when I want to say, well, okay, like if now I want to go into science, science is a particular kind of system of justification. And Popper and I would probably disagree on some aspects of this. I don't think he lacked. I'd help him narrate his three worlds. Okay, he doesn't know how to put three worlds together. The tree of knowledge puts your three worlds together very clearly and allows you to delineate their relations in a particular way. And the way in which he's trying to achieve deductive falsifiability, very valuable, but also limited and not the entire scientific process of justification system, picture. But
right.
It
There's
is
certainly some things that we can know from science without doing any experiments. We can, the classical thing in ecology is you look at a lake, right? And this lake has what is it? Fertilizer. It's surrounded by farmland with fertilizer in the watershed. Here's a lake that doesn't have that, right? And you don't have that. You could, let's do an experiment. You take a lake and you put buoys down the middle, and you put fertilizer in half of the lake and not the other. You don't need to replicate it. It's crystal clear that every inch of. So I would agree that there's a formalism to Popper, but Popper's been my hobby horse for decades and decades, and he refused to bring in the subjective scientist out of a moral stance. It wasn't an objective stance that he left the objective scientist out. It was in reaction to the Vienna Circle. He saw where things were going. All the confirmatory science that you're doing, it's not really science, because you could just line up confirming instances to convince anybody of anything. But sure. I actually wrote a paper for a Journal of Philosophy of Science once as a graduate student, where I demonstrated that in this I used his calculus, in his formal calculus, and I said, well, wait a minute, what is the value of the objective scientist in this? It's in the background knowledge. If you do an experiment and you have one subjective worldview and you're the only scientist, and then you write your paper, you don't have the same scope of background knowledge. And so in the interpretation of the evidence that the test gives you, you can actually be limited in your ability to properly interpret the evidence. Whereas if the background knowledge is 300 people in a room, in a conference or something, right, then they can say, hey, wait a minute. So we have the collective background knowledge, and the subjectivity of that individual is expanded to the subjectivity of the group. And because we saw that dynamism, the editor of the journal said that nobody uses Popper's calculus anymore. That was their excuse.
No, it's definitely
So that's
so.
like, okay, that's a justification. Um,
Right.
but
So their bottom line is you'll see them everywhere. Okay. You can range in the way I actually use the term, the way in which Einstein arrives at E equals mc squared can be thought of as a kind of analytic justification. Okay.
for sure.
And it ranges all the way from analytic justifications to through subjective and personal exchanges into defensive rationalizations. A defensive rationalization is a kind of justification. So the spectrum of justification runs, the beauty of it is that it runs across the different kinds of propositional knowledge,
Okay.
things that people offer. So there are multiple kinds of justification. I'll talk about, we can put the context of justification, in other words, what drives them. I did a blog not too long ago that laid it out into 4 different contexts. So that ranged from the con game. Okay, so this is when people are basically lying and manipulating. Okay, so the propositions are deliberately misleading so that you get some other outcome. Then you have into the courtroom where there's a big concern, a big social concern about somebody doing something, and we have to decide whether to deliver punishment because they're guilty, and so then you have to defend and prosecute in a very leveraged way. Then there's the
Let's pause on
courtyard.
that. I don't want to go
Mm-hmm.
too fast on that
Mm-hmm.
because that's actual
Sure.
theater. That's theater, right? So
Mm-hmm.
we have to go through a
Mm-hmm.
process in court by law, and whether everybody in the room can know from their perspective a person's guilty, they're still entitled to that hearing, and
Sure.
we
Mm-hmm.
believe in the process. We trust in the
Right.
process, right?
Right.
In
Right.
as
So,
in as
right.
much as it's an object, it enforces a level of objectivity. And so
Right.
if we're wrong about the person being guilty, then maybe one person on the jury will recognize something in the evidence that the others didn't see. And
Sure.
I've actually had that experience in a murder trial in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania,
Mm.
where
Wow.
we sat for a week in deliberation and we were almost hung. And then I asked for one more piece of evidence. And the one more piece of evidence was something that didn't really click in my brain. And it was a picture of the house where there was a
Mm-hmm.
person that was shot to death sitting in a chair in the doorway of a house.
Mm-hmm.
This is in
Mm-hmm.
Homewood, Pennsylvania. And the shooter allegedly walked up and put his hand into the door beyond the door frame and shot down into. That was the description. And the girlfriend that was in the house swore that it was this guy because you could see his hand. His fingers were really long, and so
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking at all the evidence. We really couldn't come to it. And I finally I said, does anybody on the jury have any knowledge about this type of gun? And there was a guy who was a Vietnam vet. And he said, yes.
Mm-hmm.
I said, well, where do the shell casings go from the gun? And he said that they go up and to the right. And I said, well,
Mm-hmm.
she described the gun as being pointed down, and there were no shell casings in the house. They were all on the steps, and they were all on the there were no shell casings. So that impeached her testimony, and
Mm-hmm.
there was that made a great deal of sense to the jury because we couldn't figure out how the gun that was used. I don't know if people know this or not, but any gun has its own rap sheet, right? So they recovered a gun by accident by arresting some people in a
Mm-hmm.
car on the north side of Pittsburgh. They got the gun, they
Mm-hmm.
matched it forensically to this murder, and the gun was stolen
Mm-hmm.
from a house in central Pennsylvania, and it was used. The crime was north side, north side, north side, Homestead, north side. So it went from Homestead back to north side, and the guy
Mm-hmm.
who was in the house with his girlfriend during the shooting said that he jumped out the back of the house and found a jitney and rode over to the north side. So then we could see how the gun got to the north side. This was a guy
Mm-hmm.
that wanted the job, a heroin dealer in the doorway.
Mm-hmm.
So this young man who was charged with murder, he got off because one guy, me, recognized the evidence, right? So there it is
Right.
again. Like you were in the middle. You had 4 things you were laying out. There's 4 types of
Mm-hmm.
justification. So we were just talking about
Well, yeah. One of the things the justification. One of the things that it does is that it embodies our propositional knowledge in the world, okay, and puts it in social and emotional, motivational context. Which is for a psychologist, that's I need that because our reasoning in everyday world, our reasoning is very embodied and motivational. But anyway, so yes, so one, we can think about the ways in which people structure systems of justification, what they're trying to do and why. A con game is one, so that's just when you're lying and manipulating, deceiving. where all the motivation is to actually hide the actual truth and the propositions are lies.
Right.
Then we move into this court case. You mentioned, yes, we formalize them, especially in like civilizations when we're not hanging out with our family members. When we have novel elements and powerful states, we better want to formalize the punishment process when we defer it over to the state, and we better have lots of checks and balances. But it is also the case that is a very motivated structure where you're determining who is to be punished and who is not to be punished in that context. Then you move into the courtyard, which is our metaphor for sort of everyday engagement, kind of like this conversation would be in the courtyard, where we're sharing narrative about the commons and what's going on, and offering banter and ideas and dialogue and dialectic. And your families have got to decide where they're going on vacation and what the rules are and all that. That would be all under that. And then you can move over ultimately into a lab. Okay. And different labs then afford different kinds of control settings, and more analytic, deductive, powers of inference that tie to mathematics and empirical findings, and certainly physics, sort of does the most alignment in relationship to, at least certainly domains of physics, does the most alignment in relationship to the ways in which our logic, mathematical systems structure, the way we can control for various elements, the way we can rule out alternative explanations. And so the lab, the courtyard, the courtroom, and the con game provide a nice analysis of the relationship between sort of motive, bias, and the ways in which we structure our propositional knowledge and justify our actions.
I appreciate that. Thanks for taking the time to spell those out. So in this concept of justification, then, to go to the extreme, we're going to do a thought process model here, where what if humanity, when humanity, let's say we could potentially do this, everything written in every textbook, everything published in every news article, everything published on the internet, every thought held in everyone's head, again, hypothetical, was so closely matched to reality that it was almost, one-to-one correspondence with the truth. We're right at that asymptote. We're just, it's so thin you can barely tell the difference. Is there any room for what you call justification there?
Okay. So again, it depends a little bit on what you mean. Okay. In terms of if we are aligning our ontologies, our propositional ontologies, with reality in a one-to-one correspondence, okay, right, then simply the propositional ontology is simply mapping onto the correspondence.
Right.
And so that's indeed the ideal of science, or at least the idealized representation of science, is to achieve that mapping, and whether or not you can achieve that mapping. Okay, which then is to basically a transcendent justification of an accurate ontology to the ontic reality. That's
okay. I see a transcendent, because you're so close enough. There's somebody, right? I got it. So it's transcendent. It's amazing to me that people today don't realize that simply because something's coming out of a scientist's mouth, that it's not the truth. it's almost a gaslighting situation, right? We have this hierarchy of categories of people. We can talk about medical knowledge. We can talk about, right? And people are kind of getting used to it, but it's frustrating. Like, well, I thought butter was bad for you. I thought butter was good for you. Now they're saying, okay, if we look into without any chicanery, the public has to come to understand that different parts of knowledge are more mature than others. Different parts of science, what we call scientific knowledge, and I'm distinct.
Absolutely.
The difference between knowledge and the truth is, in my view, light years different. There's a big difference between what we call knowledge and the truth. And so, thank you for explaining that there's an outside of reality, transcendental, third position view, metaphysical, and that leads to one of the other questions. So. And people reading your stuff might appreciate this too. My next question happens to be, when you say we need a clear descriptive medical physical system in your description of the tree of knowledge, what are you talking about? A metaphysical system? I mean, is this a appeal to a conjectural fantasy reality to explain reality? Or what are you doing, Gregg?
Yes. Good. So thank you. Right. So scientists, if you're a scientist out there and you hear the metaphysics, you're going to freak, right? It's like, that's my prediction. So here's the deal. So let's back it up. And yes, I want to be everyone. Don't worry, everyone. I'm a scientist. Okay. You know,
I told, listen, guys, I said to Greg
yeah.
before we started, I hope we're still friends when we're done with this. And I
Right.
honestly
Okay.
mean that. This is an
Yeah.
opportunity for me to learn what you mean by
Right.
that without
Right.
making it
So
into anything that's, this is not, I'm not side, I'm not T-boning this guy. I gave him a fair warning at the beginning that this was going to be something that we're going to try to understand and get under the hood here.
totally. So
With
right. So
total
let's understand it. So 10 years ago, I would have never used the term because I had the idea. When I heard the term metaphysics, I had the idea of what I would now call pure metaphysics. Okay. So pure metaphysics is what Galileo hated, and why he invented he became the father of modern science, because he hated the pure metaphysical speculation that was running rampant in the scholastic age. Okay, where everybody would see a cause and then they would project some underlying essence against that cause, and then they were constantly using Aristotle's ultimate purpose and teleology to define ways in which were unbelievably tautological and useless. Okay. And
Yes, I'm
so,
laughing because I have a punchline about that. I'm sorry, I couldn't hold myself. It's about quantum physics, and we're going to get to that later. Go ahead.
okay, well, that's, yeah. So, so anyway, so you have this issue, and then, and Galileo, father of men's knowledge, and with good reason, is like, I hate this. I want to ground everything in my empirical observation of matter in motion, and I want to bring my mathematical deductive knowledge to that. And that's what knowledge fundamentally is about. And everything else, okay, needs to be pushed to the side. And they created a split. All right. And then, so scientists then assumed that they could get by on logic and empiricism. Look at the logical positivists. Okay. Well, it turns out that as a psychologist, the idea that you need to have a framework for defining your concepts and categories and what they mean in the field of relation turns out to be an unbelievably important thing. Okay. So now I'm going to back up and then be like, well, what we actually need, what I realized they actually needed was a descriptive metaphysics. Okay. A descriptive metaphysics tied to our empirical findings. All right. So a descriptive, do you use the concept object? Do you use the concept field? Do you use the concept object field change over time, which I would argue that the actual metaphysical concept that science tends to use is the frame of behavior, which is object field change. Okay. So what we want to do is we want to say, hey, we are scientists. We're bringing concepts to bear and categories to bear on the reality source. Kant, if you go to Kant, and I'm sort of a Kantian, but I'm not in many ways. But anyway, you have a category of mind that says, hey, there's space, there's time, there's things. Okay. And as a scientific knower, you are bringing concepts and categories to carve up the world. So what I am arguing for is a descriptive metaphysics. Okay. And by the way, I was on this trail and then got accelerated into this trail when I found Lawrence Calhoun's The Orders of Nature. Okay. It's a 2013 book, who offers a wonderful articulation that naturalism, okay, should not simply be thought of in terms of empirical science, meaning that you can't really delineate naturalism, just a natural big history view, through the empirical method alone. You need to reflect on the concepts and categories and their interrelation, because you adopt a grammar of understanding from the sociocultural historical context in which you're born, indeed the Enlightenment context, which brings an enormous number of underlying pre-empirical suppositions about the relationships between concepts and categories.
Totally.
Okay. So the proper term that I came to argue for that is that we need a descriptive metaphysics to attend to those concepts and categories pre-empirical, and anchored to our empirical world. So by descriptive metaphysics, I always say, well, it's to the empirical dialectic, by the way. And if you can't attach it to the pure dialectic, then you're doing pure metaphysics, and then go off into theology and New Age ontology and astrology and whatever the hell else you want to do. Okay, so I am a scientist that's actually saying what Galileo did rightfully was get us out of pure metaphysics. What he did wrong was think that we didn't need the concept of metaphysics anymore. No, we need pre-empirical concepts and categories formulation. And actually, it turns out that metaphysics is a really good word for that, descriptive metaphysics.
So it's more along the lines of, not to belittle it in any way, but you have to have a permission slip to go outside of the system that you're studying in an imaginary framework, so that it's like a notepad, right? So I might be, say, a mechanic working on a car. There's a lot of things going wrong, but you know what? I work on cars all the time. I've worked on 500 this year already. I damn well better write down what I'm doing. And in writing down, it's a outside of the car, outside of my head understanding, right? And so I'm going to write down and keep track of what's going on, so that you have this third viewer position, which I do it all the time. Metaphysics is something that's going to take a lot for me to accept that phrase myself because of the other connotations, but you've outlined the delineation perfectly, and I thank you for that. It is going to take a lot to kind of shake that, that fear that I'm invoking.
So
noodly appendages of the spaghetti monster or something, right?
Right. Well, hate pure metaphysics. But what you actually do as a scientist is you bring your concepts and categories, and then you try to ground them in empirical findings. So your the concepts and categories are something, and they ain't just math.
I'll leave the hate for the haters. What I want to do is I want to say there is a delineation, a demarcation. If science can't test it, if there's not grounded in some empirical framework to try to understand it, it is just, you can always explain anything away by another explanation, right? The noodly appendages of the spaghetti monster example. Then you're really outside of the realm of what we can be comfortable calling science. So far from what I hear from you is that your framework is definitely in the realm of science. You want to understand things, both, you want to understand mechanisms of causality and not just attribute them to something outside of that. And I always knew that. I just wanted to hear you explain this.
Right. So I mean, the real issue is So and because it's close to my heart as a psychologist, is I realized that I didn't really know what was science, what was behavior, and what was mind as a psychologist. Okay. So what the heck are those things? All right. Because what I find in my discipline is that people try to jam those things together to generate a science of mind and behavior, or behavior and mental process, or whatever. And lo and behold, you can't take those concepts and put them together coherently. That's a miracle, or at least I had to wake up to that fact. And so then it's this issue, well, what are the concepts and categories that actually might be up to the task of generating what I would say is a coherent science of psychology? That's been part of my whole, developmental professional trajectory.
Well done, I must say. Really well done with that. That's why I'm enamored with, you're not responsible for the details of how close each individual area of inquiry in the tree of knowledge has come. The public, if they're going to come to understand the tree of knowledge as something useful to them, like, what would you tell them? Say, a set of parents that are trying to decide whether to homeschool or not based on coronavirus. They don't want to mask their kid all day. How do they relate to something so abstract as this tree of knowledge?
Yeah. Great. So basically, the simplest way to think about the tree of knowledge is to think about it in terms of, let's start with a basic schema of how you understand science. Do they have any background in sort of understanding what science is about? Okay. And so most people will say, well, what do you think of science? And well, there's physics, right? And that's how stuff moves. And, there's like Newton, and he did like how stuff, gravity, and then and then there's chemistry, right? And we understand that chemistry is above physics in some way. They may know then that there's been, there's something about quantum mechanics, and Einstein did something. Okay. And then it gets really funky, and then above physics, right, you have biology. Somehow things get to be alive, and biologists study what's alive. And they study ecology, and they study genes, and they study cells. Okay. And so, yeah, you have the physical and life sciences with, so great. And then the issue is, well, then what happens? Okay. And then the traditional answer is, well, you get neuroscience, trying to really figure out how the brain works. And then we'll figure out how those brain scientists are really the people that figure out how the mind works. And then you have the fluffy social science out there, which say important things, but they don't really have real knowledge in what they're talking about. But it's interesting to look at because it blends into history, and then that gets us into the humanities and other kinds of issues. So I kind of want to understand that. And if you have that understanding, okay, that's great. That means you have a basic modernist schematic, okay, of where the world sits. Okay. Now, what I want to basically say is I want to bring a lot more clarity to that, okay, with a new map that's actually also a really old map. Okay. It's a really old map in the sense that it's very similar to the map that Aristotle generated. Okay. So Aristotle generated a map called the Scales of Nature. All right. And he classified, for Aristotle, really science was about taxonomy. Okay. And he classified everything and like every other human culture in the world, okay, when Aristotle went out and brought stuff back, he developed a 4-category classification. Okay. And the first was that there's inanimate stuff. You bring back rocks, you can watch water flow. Okay. You can do a whole bunch of things, and there's that inanimate. And then you bring back plants. Okay. Which of course Aristotle did not understand cells or the cellular level of biology, but he understood plants. And plants have a particular vegetative form and function to them. They grow, they metabolize, they reproduce. Okay. Mm-hmm. And then he brought back animals, and animals behave very differently than plants. Okay. They have an animal sensory motor soul he would use, which actually he'd use the word psyche. Okay. Cool. Which he'd be referring to the form and function of animals. And then guess what? You had a rational, social, political animal called human persons that had these rational souls. Okay. And so the inanimate, the animate, plant, the animal, and then the rational. That was the scales of nature. Okay. And Christianity comes and puts angels and God on the next, and then has a 6-layer ladder or, of great chain of being, which becomes the most important Western conception. Okay. Yeah. Now, so if you see that, then you say, well, okay, well, let's line up the inanimate with the matter, and let's line that up with the physical sciences, and let's line up animate with the biology, life sciences. Okay. And then let's recognize that things kind of get complicated. You go into neuroscience, okay, and then you hit my discipline,
psychology, behavior,
and you get you get into my discipline, and then everything, all hell breaks out in terms of the actual understanding. The tree of knowledge gives you an invitation to say, wait a minute, there's a way to understand why it gets so confusing and a way to make it pretty simple.
I agree.
Okay,
I agree. It's worth looking at because my understanding of the evolution of psychology, and I talked with you about this on the other video, mm-hmm. is that there was the authorities in psychology early on had a very phenomenological, and a heavily justified thing, projection of, I understand this person's problem because they had a problem with their mother, or they want to have sex with their mother, or whatever. This is the origins of something that we want to make into a science here. In the meantime, biology's emerging in genetics, physics is coming along with radiation, the same time in that period, and chemistry. Oh my God, they were discovering everything under the sun. There's a new element in the newspaper every day. And so this distinction between the soft sciences and the hard sciences, I think, can go away. And I think you've laid out a map, from matter to life to mind to culture, right, that we can benefit mm-hmm. from, where there's a smooth transition of psychology. If there's going to be right. gyrations, there's going to be right. people that are making money hand over fist right now by fixing everything in behavior with a drug, right, as opposed to fundamental understanding. And there is that. That's a small thing, but. But when it comes down to it, I think it's worth looking at the philosophy of science and the evolution of the philosophy of science in parallel. I've been very frustrated with the philosophy of science myself, frankly, because some people who I had bet my horse on, people that I know, and I won't mention their name, they just went the route of, what are you going to do about it?
Hmm.
They just kind of
Hmm.
gave up, in my view. They didn't take, the next step. And I'm talking about
Right.
biologists and evolutionary biologists,
Hmm.
who just, basically gave up on transforming our understanding of science. So there's the metaphysical framework. Let's talk about the philosophy of science. Is a medical physical
Hmm.
framework to itself, and that it's a reflection upon this thing that we call science. And as a defender of the public's trust in science, I'm absolutely hopping mad at the minorities that have taken control of and used and abused, in my view, the Kuhnian paradigm, the
Mm.
rules of playing on the game board of Kuhnian paradigm shifts, by being the loudest person in the room or the one with the most money, and they can get on the television the most, and they can
Right.
impact the largest number of minds. And so
Hmm.
I think what you've done here, Greg, and are doing here is a fine thing, um, for the public. And so what I'd like to do is, give you some time to close out, but you've generously given permission for me to play a video that I think you just recently put it together
I
at the end.
actually this morning. Yeah. Hmm.
So this is real
So that's
time here,
recent.
folks.
That's hot
Yeah,
off the car. There you
so
go.
it's called Solving the BM3, and it's the body, mind. There's three
Uh,
visions of mind that Greg has would
Actually,
like to
it's
share. Oh,
the
sorry,
B
go
is
ahead.
behavior.
Oh, sorry,
I'm sorry,
my bad.
behavior. It's behavior,
Behavior,
mind, mind,
mind,
mind.
and mind. And you're going to
Hmm.
see a lot of what my friends and some people close to me call chipmunk talk, where there's a lot of big words. But hopefully, we've broken down some of those big words for you today. I can sleep better knowing that you're not a justificationist. I can sleep better knowing that you're not a metaphysicist, right? Thank you, Greg. I
Not a
promise
pure
you.
metaphysicist, right? A
No,
pure
no.
meta. I embrace descriptive metaphysics, but I reject pure metaphysics. So
Yeah,
that's a
now
little
I know the
tweak.
distinction, and then who knows what we'll come up with. But where can people find your blog?
My blog's on Psychology Today right now. It's Theory of Knowledge, so you can go there. If you have a place in the show notes, the Unified Theory of Knowledge.org is my homepage. I'll be happy to put up the link to the video I just released as well on the BM3 problem. And basically, in the nutshell of that, is so the science of psychology tries to be the science of behavior and mental process. Okay. So BM3 is you have to know what you mean by behavior, which we don't. And you have to know what you mean by mental process, which we don't. And so what this video is it says, hey, there's a way to think about behavior that's kind of different than normal. When we back up and see behavior writ large, keep in mind atoms behave, so things are complicated if atoms behave. Okay. So we have to understand behavior in a particular way. Then we have to understand mental process. There are three different sort of reference for mental processes that have different epistemological, meaning how you know about them, considerations. And this offers a way to map those. So then we could actually have a coherent scientific definition of behavior and mental process. That's the dream.
Right, and this is actually a small part of the tree of knowledge, because this is about the theory of mind, which is a one of the branches on your tree of
Right.
knowledge.
It's really about, right. The argument is that the Enlightenment modernist system that comes up with science and Kant and all the philosophers, so the philosophers and science just together, they don't solve the matter mind problem, meaning we do not have the right grammar for how to talk about the relationship of matter and mind. That's one of the things that the tree of knowledge solves is
Yeah,
it says, actually, here's a conceptual field. So this is an extension of you applying the tree of knowledge ultimately to get the matter mind relationship, the grammar of matter and mind correctly aligned.
absolutely. So there were some struggles early on in the philosophy of science to solve Hume's problem, what makes us different from animals, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in that, we have the Great Leap Forward, the genetic study that shows that, wait a minute, there's some fundamental things that happened not too long ago that do, in
Mm-hmm.
fact, do separate us in terms of descriptively and mechanistically. Our brains are wired differently, they're structured differently, they develop differently. And so I would like to offer this as the reason why I want to play this video is there's a possible future where our society loses faith in science. And that's funny to say it
Yes.
that way. I don't want them to have faith in science because it's not about belief. And I don't want that, I'm probably modest to a fault in this, but I don't want the celebrity age to continue. We don't need any further,
Hmm.
celebrities
Yeah,
that can become
no doubt.
captured and misrepresent reality. Uh,
Totally.
and the authoritarian age has to end. And so if it's about changing our culture, a normative natural development would come to a place where more people understand a lot of the details of science that takes PhDs or MDs who study science and scientists like yourself years to accumulate that. It's worth investing. If you want to appreciate science, you don't want to break up with science and make that part of the divorce. They get the science, we get the dog. Okay. Right? If we want to carry science into the future, I think it's worth taking a good look at some of the aspects of the tree of knowledge and helping it's a great area to get into in terms of understanding ourselves, and boy do we really need to start to be able to understand ourselves. So
Yeah.
Greg, as I
Thank
promised, yeah, you're welcome.
you.
You're doing a great job. As I
Hmm.
promised, we're still friends, right? Still
Hey man,
friends.
absolutely, absolutely right. So, really the tree of, although it criticizes aspect of science, it's really trying to decide actually what can we trust in science. I believe that we can trust, for example, Big Bang. I believe we can trust quantum mechanics, general relativity. I think Newton mechanics works at the right level of the object level. The periodic table of the elements works. A sense of genetics, natural selection, cytology, all of that's good knowledge. I actually think we can get the brain aligned with neurocognitive and behavioral models to understand animal behavior and writ large. I think we can then place a human language mind on top of that. I believe that we can consolidate science. E. Wilson talked about consilience. I'm a fan of that concept. The tree of knowledge offers a path in that direction. And then we can actually understand what we mean by scientific knowledge and know also what is so what happens is, like you mentioned, medicine. So medicine, let's be very clear, medicine is also a profession. Medicine's an applied issue. Medicine is trying to manage an enormous number of what we should do now in a pragmatic context. That means it's dealing with the unbelievable complexity of reality, not abstract truth claims like quantum mechanics, where we can actually get a lot better at and then decide what you should do. Should you take this pill for you right now, given
Right.
your body weight, given your place? That's a much more complicated issue. It's got to be much more ephemeral in terms of how reliable it is. But we've given scientists a mantle, and now they're failing, and now people are dangerously going to lose track of that. We lose track of our scientific knowledge base. Well, welcome to chaos. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. What I'd like to do is help usher in an era of adaptive um, responsiveness, adaptive flexibility in medicine. There's a whole other way to go about this, and there's a lot of knowledge out there and things that are working for people, including COVID-19. That it's not, to me, it doesn't look as dangerous as it has to be, and allopathy has
Mm-hmm.
a long way to go. In a few weeks, we're going to be doing about 4 or 5 series on what's wrong with allopathy. And you're right, it's not
Mm-hmm.
fair to take a practiced living practice and say, look at these guys, they're not scientists because they don't do things according to a certain methodology. And it's reassuring to know that perhaps some of the salve on some of these injuries that we're self inflicting on ourselves in our society these days, especially in terms of the threat to the loss of science, is that you routing multiple pathways on methodology without just saying anything goes. And
Mm-hmm.
being a methodologist myself, I worked very hard at the University of Pittsburgh to to make sure that when somebody took 40,000 genes or 20,000 genes and you had that number of measurements and maybe 100 patients, and now you're going to try to
Hmm.
analyze the data, you don't just get the result that you want because you chose. I used to say it like this: what method should I use? Well, that guy knows how to plug in the computer, so ask him. That was really like
Right.
almost literally like it was. Just throw anything at it, you're going to get a result, and then you have to justify your result on the basis of what you found, as opposed to knowing that this is another. Here's a method out of 450 methods. The combinations of transformation, normalization, data representation, what test for your hypothesis, and then you're going to do cluster analysis on top of that. You've got this n-dimensional method space. Pick one. Go ahead. I dare
Yeah.
you. Right. So
Yeah.
I
No.
actually
No.
I created a framework by which we could formalize that based on
Mm-hmm.
the reproducibility of the finding. If you split, it's a machine learning based approach. You split the data multiple
Mm.
times, you analyze it 450 ways, and you find the methods that are at least internally consistent and
Nice. Mm-hmm.
reproducible. And luckily, we found that the methods that we were training towards after 100 data sets,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that right, 100 individual studies, they we found the ones that tended to validate with with PCR. People are all
Yeah.
about PCR right now. It's a different thing. I'm not talking about RT-PCR viruses, believe me. But it's reassuring and refreshing to know that the tree of knowledge is allowing for different um, frameworks in science to come through this transition. I do think it's a window of opportunity. And so thanks
Yeah.
for doing what you're doing, Greg. I really appreciate it. And thanks again for
Uh,
being here. And thank you for allowing me to share the solving the behavior mind 3 problem. That's how we're going to end out. You feel free to sign out when you want to,
okay.
but I'm going to hit the play button on this. And thanks again, Greg.
Wonderful. Yeah. I've seen this one, so I will go ahead and sign out then.
Right on.
Thanks so
Good man.
much. You take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay. Welcome to this TOK 21 educational video on solving the BM3 problem, defining behavior and mental processes. The BM3 problem is another way to state the problem of psychology in that it refers to the fact that given standard modern empirical natural scientific knowledge frameworks, one cannot coherently generate a science of mind and behavior. The BM3 problem is named because it refers to the problem of behavior and the 3 different domains of mental processes. Thus, this translates into the behavior mind 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 problem, or BM3. The unified theory of knowledge solves the BM3 problem with a combination of the periodic table of behavior and the map of mind 1, 2, 3. Keep in mind that the problem of psychology is the fact that modernists failed to define a coherent science of mind/behavior. Started as psychophysics, which gives rise to Wundt's conception of the field and the focus on trained introspection on inner experience. Functionalism emerged and looks at the adaptive nature of mental life. Then Watson identifies the classic behavioral position, which adopted both the epistemology and physicalist ontology of matter and motion. Freud then focused on the dynamic unconscious and its role in psychopathology and developed psychoanalysis as a method. These multi-paradigmatic systems emerged because the Enlightenment had no coherent framework for the mind-matter problem. And ever since, psychology has never found a solution, so that it exists today as the science of behavior, the science of behavior of mental processes studied by behavior, the science of animal, including human, or just human behavior and mental process, the process by which humans reflect in the causes of their thoughts and feelings. This actually gives rise to a metapsychological / philosophical approach to psychology, or way of thinking about it. A justification system for thinking about the human mind and developed by Western European enlightened men. Here, this yokes the idea of empiricism with the social justice and social contextual postmodern, post-structuralist, critical race feminist theory view of the emergence of scientific justifications. And it is also the case that psychology has evolved into an identity of a profession that's concerned with mental illness adjustment and well-being. The reason that this is so difficult is because we have grounded our understanding on an enlightenment system of knowledge that is broken and inadequate. This is clear in the Enlightenment gap, which reveals to two major failures of modernist Enlightenment metaphysics, namely the mind-matter problem and the social versus scientific knowledge problem. The mind-matter problem is seen most obviously in René Descartes, who argued that one had to adopt a dualism of sorts to make sense out of the world. It's also crucial to understand that modern Enlightenment 1.0 thinkers have failed to understand what science is relative to social knowledge. From an Enlightenment 2.0 unified theory of knowledge perspective, science is a kind of justification system built on an exterior empirical epistemology, logic, experimentation, and inference to best explanation. Science connection to social power and culture was poorly framed by modernist thinkers. Thus, men's knowledge gives rise to the postmodern critique, which must be contextualized and then synthesized in a metamodern perspective. Because of the Enlightenment gap, there is no way to define a science of mind and behavior. Psychology's core metaphysical problem can be stated as such. Consciousness and behavior do not seem to mesh. They're oil and water. We can see this most clearly in Ken Wilber's epistemological quadrants, who readily identifies the interior perspective on the world, the interior epistemology of I and we, as radically different than the exterior epistemology of a third-person perspective. He notes accurately that the language game of science is grounded in an exterior empirical epistemology. We see that the exterior epistemology is tied to behavior, and consciousness or phenomenology is a first-person interior epistemology. So we have an epistemological problem that creates a grammar of understanding difficulty so that the knowledge justification systems of the language game of science is inaccessible to the interior, or at least the way in which it gains access is enormously confusing. Things get increasingly complicated because there is, in fact, also an ontological problem. This is the explanatory gap of how the holistic activity of the brain generates the witnessing and experiencing portions of mind. The explanatory gap at the level is the level of the mechanism by which the brain activity generates first-person perspective. We can refer to this as the ontological aspect of the hard problem of consciousness. People do not realize that the epistemological aspect and the ontological aspect intersect to make the hard problem what it is. Ultimately, we have a problem of psychology and a BM3 problem because we've lacked an adequate theory of knowledge that places the theory of reality, the knower, and in relationship to the known that can provide a proper descriptive metaphysics of these elements. We need a clear descriptive metaphysical system that organizes empirical findings. This is what the flower in the Utah tree in the Garden of Atua represents. And it is part of the framework and insights that generate an Enlightenment 2.0 and the move towards wisdom-oriented modern empirical natural science, a meta-modern view that then places humanistic and spiritual concerns on a naturalistic view and allows us to place ourselves in the cosmos and orient toward what might or ought to be in the future going forward. The TOK system, the first branch on the Utah tree, provides the proper metaphysical frame for both cosmic evolution, or ontic reality, and the scientific knowledge of it. Here is the tree of knowledge system, which divides the world into the ontic reality and our scientific ontoepistemological knowledge about that reality. The TOK system provides the metaphysics to solve the Enlightenment gap. It reconceptualizes the mind versus matter relation and then clarifies old misunderstandings. It also specifies modern empirical natural science as a particular kind of justification system. Turning to the BM3 problem, we first turn to the problem of behavior. The nature of scientific ontoepistemology is to see the world through behavioral glasses. The epistemological stance of a scientist is to be positioned as a third-person observer that is measuring object field change. Science thus observes the universe through the conceptual grammar of object field change or behavior. This means that the language game of science is committed to an exterior epistemology that involves objects and fields as its and change as part of its metaphysical architecture. To be a science, it means that psychology has to turn mind into behavior. This means we need to understand what behavior is. The behaviorists simply said that psychology is the science of behavior. However, this is a gross error, because according to physicists, physics is the science of behavior of the universe at all levels, the behavior of matter and energy and their interactions. Therefore, it is impossible and illogical to consider psychology as the science of behavior. This remarkable fact has been overlooked time and time again. We can see this clearly by considering that electrons behave when they interact with force fields, organic molecules behave as they unfold in a catalytic reaction, planets behave as they circle around a star, cells behave as they move toward food sources, countries behave as they go to war. Psychologists cannot be interested in behavior in general, but instead are interested in a particular kind of behavior. According to the tree of knowledge, all system and unified theory of knowledge in general, all sciences are sciences of behavior. The reason is that behavior is a concept that frames exterior epistemology. Behavior equals an observer measuring and tracking object field change from the outside. The tree of knowledge gives rise to a 3x4 level ontological view of behavioral complexity called the periodic table of behavior. This will allow us to solve the problem of behavior and then situate us to solve the problem of mental processes. So the periodic table of behavior provides a map of the kinds of behaviors in the universe and the sciences that maps those behaviors at the various levels and dimensions. So here is the periodic table of behavior. We see across the top there are dimensions of behavioral complexity. These correspond to the big four planes of existence mapped by the tree of knowledge system. This gives rise to a general object field relation of objects and fields at the material level, organisms and ecologies at the life level, animals and environments at the mind level, and persons and societies at the culture level. There are also primary levels of analysis. Particle. We can start with a pure energy singularity and then move into object field relations at the level of particle, into atoms, into molecules, then jump over to life, have genes, cells, multi-cell colony, big life as it's known in big history. Then we move into the animal dimension where neural networks coordinate whole animal bodies with complex active bodies and brains to invest in object field change. This sets up family groups mapped by behavioral, ecological, sociological traditions. Then we jump as a function of symbolic justification, self-conscious person behavior, and network together to family, nations, and communities. This in turn allows us to clearly organize the domains of science divided by the levels and dimensions and scale. We can see this clearly here where the physical sciences map the matter dimensions across scale. The standard elementary particle physics sits at the base. Then we move into the periodic table of the elements, who map each atomic element. Then we have chemistry, which is often considered the central science of molecular behavior. We then move into the biological sciences that start with microbiology and genetics, into cytology, then into larger organisms and ultimately ecology, finally with environmental sciences at the largest scale. We also need to note physiology and anatomy. There's the science of genetics at the base of biology, which serves as the fundamental molecular biological hybrid between chemistry and biology and the fundamental units of information storage and communication across generations. Cytology is the fundamental unit of biology, i.e. the science of cells. Then we have botany and mycology, managing plant and fungi systems. This organizes us around the stem of the hard sciences that are relatively consilient, where we have the physical sciences mapping matter and the biological sciences mapping life. We can also note here that the biological branch of neuroscience is attempting to maintain the logic the ontology and epistemology of the natural sciences, as we will see, is because of this confusion of a relationship to the neuro into cognitive behavioral sciences, where an enormous amount of the breakdown happens. Things go soft at psychology. Okay? This actually, we can then ask questions about what about animal behavior science. We can also ask questions here about what about experiential knowledge and the first-person perspective on the world. The tree of knowledge identifies the basic psychological sciences at the level of the mental animal, the evolution of the nervous system over time into animal groups. And so we start with neural networks identified by people like Hebb, into the basic bodily movements of things like nematodes, which serves as the fundamental base, but then that evolves into complex active bodies. It's a major shift. By the time we get insects, we have the first layer of mentation clearly operating. Then we see the vertebrate line emerge and get increasingly complex, or increasingly at least more human-like, and we can put this all into a socio-behavioral ecological systems. I recommend Carl Safina's Beyond Words to see the ways in which animals build what we can call animal small c culture, and the important dynamics that are associated with that. Neuroscience represents then the hybrid between biology and psychology. We then have zoology, which looks at animals as organisms, and ethology and comparative psychology looks at animal behavior in nature, which, according to the Tree of Knowledge, has been missed, crucially missed in relationship to our fundamental understanding. This stems back to Enlightenment gap errors and failure to conceptualize properly what is meant by mind. We then have the cognitive behavioral neurosciences along with comparative psychology, which together afford us an experimental scientific analysis of animal mental behavior. So we have neural networks, learning, information processing, early maps of things like associative conditioning as well as operant conditioning, and higher order decision making. All of this then is the way in which we can scientifically explore the domain of the mental. This is what we will identify as Mind 1 and a neurocognitive functionalist view of mental behavior. It's important to note here that we have group sociobiology in relationship to animal group behavior. And notice here, sociobiology really should be called socio-animal psychology. And that includes anywhere from ant behavior up until the behavior of primates or other quote-unquote higher animals. Then we jump into the human sciences, and the reason is there's a function of linguistics and justification. Then we get the emergence of the really dual human mind of the experiential and behaving system into the narrating system, both private and public. This, of course, can be tracked by the emergence then of culture and cultural anthropology. We see large-scale modern society arrangements in relationship to then modern market economic economies that shape the world, as well as the sociological and then macro global transnatural perspective, all of which can be at least modeled and mapped by the social sciences. The human cognitive science performs the base of the 10th floor base of the fourth dimension with linguistics and human cognition. Human personality, developmental and social psychology serve as the fundamental frame then for what might be called the 11th floor. We're on the 11th. If each dimension has 3 primary level floors, so particle, atom, molecule, gene, cell, multicell, neural network, mind-brain system, family group, symbolic justification, self-conscious personhood, and then family, community, nation, which is Mind 3. And then finally, we get the proper social sciences dealing with social groups. The point ultimately of the PTB is that behavior is a central concept in scientific knowledge. It is an epistemological justification. It sets the stage for the ontological theories of the ontic reality. Scientific knowledge, thus, can be seen as consisting, or at least natural science, consists of the claims about the nature of object field change justified by the scientific method. This is how the Tree of Knowledge provides a theory of modern scientific knowledge. What then are mental processes? This is the M3 part of the problem. Keep in mind that the periodic table of behavior shows how mental processes must reside inside the behavioral landscape. We know that from the PTB, then mental behaviors are a particular kind of behavior. This, unfortunately, is something modernist psychologists completely fail to recognize, that they have confounded epistemological requirement of science to see the world in behavioral terms with the ontological issues associated with what their word behavior references in the real world. Consider, for example, how Speelman, in her introductory text Psychology, says the following. The word psychology was coined at a time when the concepts soul and mind were not clearly distinguished. Ology refers to the scientific study of, the psychology refers to the scientific study of the mind. However, since science studies only observable phenomena, the mind is not directly observable, we expand this behavior to the scientific study of mind and behavior. Notice the epistemological, this is stated very clearly then, that the epistemological requirement of the scientific language game then all of a sudden means that you must translate mentation into behavior. That it is by definition blinded by the third person perspective. Notice that it is the epistemological requirement then that makes mind invisible. If you were to ask me as a human being, is your mind invisible? One retort would simply be, my mind is the only thing I can see. How could it possibly be invisible? The fact here that I'd be referring to the conscious aspect of my mind that gives rise to my own phenomenologically and first-person perspective. So the idea that it is invisible to the third-person vantage point. This is a gross error and massive limitation of modernist thinking. We can see exactly what we're referring to here when we think about, now from a third-person perspective, we think about a cat falling out of a tree. And as the cat falls out of a tree, we can ask, well, what is behavior? Here we can identify, is this cat dead? If it's cat dead, then it's simply physical behaviors. Is this cat anesthetized? Then there are organic behaviors going on inside the cat. Is this cat just enjoying its capacity to drop, fall, and will land on its feet and run away? Well, if so, then those are mental behaviors. Indeed, we can give rise to the behavioral totality of the entity as a whole, but we're going to understand mental behavior, we're going to say we're not meaning, thus we are dividing out the physical gravitational effects, say, of gravity in this case, the organic behavioral processes that are happening at the level of physiology, and thus we are actually concerned with the behavior of the animal as a whole, interacting with the environment, and that is what we mean by mental behavior. So we are staring then at, we can now then recognize psychology's confusion, which then sets the stage for radically different conceptions of what we mean. So we have the behaviorists arguing that there's no way to look inside, you can only see on the outside, and thus mind must be defined as a kind of behavior. We have the cognitivists arguing very clearly that mind is a form of neurocognition, brain communication, and information processing activity as a functional effect. We then have many different individuals that identify mind essentially as the internal subjective experience. This is how David Myers actually defines mind in his psychology text. And we also have individuals arguing that that's all wrong. Also, we have mind as self-conscious narrative, something that's uniquely human. All of these are a function of faulty descriptive metaphysics that are inadequate to understanding the mind-matter relation. Knowledge and unified theory of knowledge writ large shows us how to define mind as a particular kind of behavior, as neurocognition, as the phenomenology of subjective experience, and as self-conscious reflection. We can now use the proper framing of ontology and epistemology to identify three different domains of the mental. First, Mind 1 is a neurocognitive functional analysis of mental behavior which adopts an exterior epistemological view of both behavior and physiology to define what the informational and communication aspects of the nervous system that's generating the said observed third-person patterns. We have subjective phenomenology, which is the interior first-person perspective, which cannot be crossed directly. The third and first-person experiences cannot be directly crossed. Therefore, we have an interior perspective on phenomenology. And finally, we also have, very crucially, self-conscious narration, which actually is an intersubjective bridge between the interior and exterior, mediated by the highway of language. Thus, linguistic thoughts, in their propositional form, exist as easily inside the head as outside the head. And the only issue is that an observer needs to have the frame of reference to understand what the linguistic proposition means, and as such, it can be observed in the exterior. So we have 3 radically different epistemological considerations, and 3 ontological reference that need to be sorted out. This is going to set the stage then for the proper analysis of mental processes and the map of mind 1, 2, 3. So we return to psychology's problem of consciousness and behavior with the interior and exterior epistemology. We are now going to generate a solution. Well, we have mind 1 defined scientifically in terms of functional awareness and response, okay, that then coordinates the observed functional awareness of behavior in terms of there's a response, stimulus, functional relation that can be observed, and their functional activity in the nervous system that can be interpreted through information processing communication networks that allow us to understand. There is mind 2 as conscious phenomenology, the first-person experience of being, and mind 3 as self-conscious justification. We have with mind 1 the differentiation between overt actions and neurocognitive processes, and with mind 3 we will have public versus private justification. Thus we now have located what's available from an exterior epistemology. Okay, we can debate whether neurocognitive processes are to what extent can they be observed, but all of these domains are exterior epistemological domains. In contrast, these domains are available from the interior epistemology. This then allows us to generate the map of mind 1, 2, 3, where we have the exterior and interior epistemologies. We have neurocognitive functionalism, which analyzes the nervous system as an information processing communication system, such that we can actually define the mind in proper terms, can be legitimately defined as the information instantiated within and processed by the nervous system. So we all have brain-based mediation happening here. Although just like you can't see the information in your computer, you can't directly see, or the observed nature of information is really found in the functional relations of object field change. Mind 1B is then the overt mental behavior, what the animal can observe to be doing. For an example of what happens when mind 1B gets knocked out, think of Stephen Hawking and his ALS Lou Gehrig's condition, where his motor nervous system was completely obliterated, and thus his mind 1B no longer allowed him to function. However, he clearly had mind 1A and mind 2 processes, as well as, which are his subjective phenomenological experience of self. Okay. By the way, behavioral investment theory enables us an understanding of these domains of mind. But we have also mind 3, where Stephen Hawking obviously had private self-conscious justification, and because we were able to maintain an open line of communication through remarkable information interface processes, we were able to maintain contact with his remarkable mind, and he was able to share publicly his justifications for understanding the universe and how it works. So in this frame of reference, we have 5 different domains of mind, 1A and B, 2, 3A and B. These different domains then have different ontological reference, different epistemological considerations. The unified theory, through behavioral investment theory providing the base, and then justification systems theory, understanding the updated tripartite model of mind as the experiential system corresponding to mind 2, the private narrator corresponding to mind 3, and the public self corresponding to mind 3B, and what is held in mind, overt actions as mind 1. This justification systems theory allows us clear hypotheses and dynamic analyses of the relations between the mind. For example, the attentional filter that operates between mind 1A and mind 2, the Freudian filter that can operate between mind 2 and mind 3A, i.e. how do psychodynamic and self-deception mechanisms might work in relationship to the tensions between self-conscious knowledge and experiential knowledge. And then finally, the Rogerian filter maps the mind 3A to mind 3B relation. So we now have the proper descriptive elements where mind 1A, information instantiated within and processed by the brain, aka neurocognition, can be generally referred to as the mind. And indeed, this is how Goldstein, in a recent 2020 book, essentially defines it. We want to understand that it connects to overt action, although this has to take place through neuromuscular information interface. As we gave with the example of Stephen Hawking, we can see how that can be knocked out. Subjective phenomenology is the essential miracle of whole brain activity, turning from the water of brain activity, turning to the wine of first-person experience. Then we get private self-conscious narration and public narration. Information interface is the unified theory of knowledge conception about how we can see brain versus cognitive interface, meaning information processing, neurocognitive functionalism, brain cognition and body activity. All of that, or certainly all of 1A, plus the emergence of the holistic witnessing function. That's a question about exactly what is the nature of that information processing communication system. I prefer neuronal global workspace theory. I'm also working with John Vervaeke in understanding the layering of hierarchical layering of neurocognition, how that might create a particular kinds of gestalt and at least create the proper cognitive conscious metaphysical language system that allows us to identify the various parts. And then as we have the proper language, we will then be able to see brain behavior activity from mind one perspectives. I'm a fan of Carl Friston's free energy work and prediction, and I believe that all of that will be tied together so we'll get a neuroenergy information system that allows us to eventually network that together to create an adequate map of a global neuronal workspace that then includes the mechanisms of mind two. Justification systems theory provides us, places the human culture person mind on top of the phenomenological mind, which is absolutely crucial to note that the linguistic medium fundamentally shifts and changes the interrelations between the dynamics that came before it. So we can define mental processes as behavior, mind 1B, as cognition, mind 1A, as phenomenology, mind 2, and self-conscious, both private, mind 3, A and B. There's one other piece of the BN3 problem. This is all sort of, this has the echoes of sort of an enlightenment mental individualism and rationalism. Where is this person existing in the relational world? As James Mark Baldwin notes, ego and alter are born together, and human consciousness, and I would argue social animal consciousness, is enormously shaped by the relations with others. How do we understand that? Well, the influence matrix provides a framework for mapping the intrapsychic internal working models that give rise to the internal behavioral patterns. And the influence matrix has these three dimensions on it. The first, well, the relational value and social influence black line, and then three process dimensions of power, love, and freedom. This allows us to actually map the socio-emotional affective process, as well as identify why there's so commonly a tension between self and other oriented elements. Why is this relevant in this context? Well, the matrix maps both intrapsychic, interpersonal, self-other space-time, social space-time. As such, it sets the stage for a conception of what might be called the implicit intersubjective frame of reference. This at least gives rise to an interesting speculation about a further dimensional distinction between mind 2A now, this is the internal subjective phenomenology, versus a mind 2B distinction. So mind 2B, notice that plays off of the words that could be spelled T-O-B-E, because the developmental world of the implicit intersubjective is absolutely crucial. And we can think about how eyes might be the windows to the soul, and the idea that there is an inner subjective participatory implicit space. This means by implicit, I mean pre-linguistic, so that we cannot bring our propositional knowledge to this. However, there is a shared attentional space that can be mapped, I believe, by the influence matrix. And to consider how remarkable, especially humans are, at shared attention, and about the interconnection between looking into the eyes of another and how mirror neurons result in yoking up individuals. So I do believe that mind 2B can be mapped or considered. And what this does is for individuals that have more of a social relational ontology of mind, it enables us to remind how much mind is co-created. Of course, the mind 3 situates our systems of justification in the socio-historical, socially constructed context, but this situates them in the interpersonal attachment dances, the interpersonal traumatizing elements. This goes right to polyvagal nerve theory in relationship to how we intuitively, immediately situate ourselves in social space and the interconnectedness that we feel with others and how that draws and defines our subjectivity as such. So, with this, we can now conclude. The BM3 problem is another way to frame the problem of psychology. It refers to the behavior mind problem and has not been solved because of the Enlightenment gap. The TOK-PTB maps the epistemological and ontological aspects of behavior writ large, and the unified theory affords a map of mind 1, 2, 3 that defines mind as neurocognition, mental behavior, phenomenology, and self-conscious justification, in addition via the influence matrix. UTOK sets the stage for understanding the impact of the participatory relational world and implicit intersubjectivity. It affords us an understanding of mind to be.